In the late 1960s, a mysterious killer known as the Zodiac left a trail of terror in Northern California. With unsolved murders, cryptic ciphers, and taunting letters, his identity remains one of true crime's greatest mysteries. Who was the Zodiac, and why has he never been caught? Let's uncover the chilling details. If you're into true crime, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most infamous cases. On the night of December 20th, 1968, in a secluded area of Vallejo, California, a young couple was parked on Lake Herman Road. Betty Lou Jensen, just 16 years old, and her boyfriend, 17-year-old David Faraday, were on their first official date. They planned to attend a Christmas concert at Hogan High School, but instead they drove to the quiet, rural area known to be a popular spot for couples seeking privacy. It was there, in the cold and darkness, that they became the first confirmed victims of the Zodiac killer. At approximately 11 p.m., an unknown assailant approached their vehicle. The attacker forced the couple out of the car at gunpoint, and in a matter of moments, David Faraday was shot in the head at point-blank range. He died instantly. Betty Lou Jensen tried to flee, running for her life, but the assailant shot her 5 times in the back as she tried to escape. Her body was found about 30 feet from the car, lifeless in the middle of the road. There were no witnesses to the crime, and the killer left no clues behind. The brutality and randomness of the attack stunned the local community. Though tragic at this point, it was viewed as an isolated incident, one of the many senseless crimes that sometimes occur in rural, quiet areas. Investigators found little to work with beyond the bullets from a .22 caliber firearm, and without witnesses or a suspect, the case quickly grew cold. Then on the night of July 4th, 1969, just over 6 months later, another attack occurred near Vallejo at Blue Rock Springs Park. Darlene Farron, 22 years old, and her friend, 19-year-old Michael Magot, were sitting in Darlene's car in the parking lot, not far from where the Lake Herman Road murders had taken place. It was shortly after midnight when another vehicle pulled up beside them, then immediately drove away. Moments later, the car returned and parked just behind them. Without warning, the driver of the second car stepped out and approached Darlene's vehicle. Armed with a 9mm Luger pistol, the attacker opened fire on both Darlene and Michael through the window. Darlene was hit multiple times, fatally wounded, while Michael was shot in the jaw, shoulder, and leg. After the initial attack, the assailant walked back to his car, but then, in a chilling move, returned to fire several more shots at the victims before finally leaving the scene. Despite his grave injuries, Michael Magot survived the attack. He provided the first description of the Zodiac killer, recalling that the shooter was a white male, likely in his late 20s to early 30s, stocky and standing about 5 feet 8 inches tall. He also remembered the make and model of the car, a brown or tan-colored vehicle. His survival gave investigators their first real lead, though the description would still prove too vague to identify the killer. The connection between the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs Park attacks wasn't immediately apparent, but soon after the second attack, the killer made sure his presence was known. On July 31, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald each received letters from an individual claiming responsibility for both attacks. Enclosed with the letters were ciphers, cryptic messages that the sender demanded be published on the front pages of each newspaper. He threatened to go on a killing spree if they failed to comply. This was the first time the killer referred to himself as Zodiac. In his letters, he boasted of his crimes and alluded to future killings, indicating that these 2 attacks were just the beginning. The cryptic nature of the letters, coupled with the ciphers, instantly grabbed the public's attention and solidified the Zodiac's notoriety. His letters would become a hallmark of the case, filled with taunts and puzzles, keeping law enforcement and the media on edge. These 2 early attacks set the tone for what would become one of the most chilling and infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history. With the Zodiac killer now revealing his presence, Investigators were left scrambling to decode his messages and prevent further attacks, but the killer's taunts were just beginning, and his reign of terror was far from over. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac killer struck again, this time at Lake Berryessa, a secluded area popular with hikers and picnickers located in Napa County, California. Brian Hartnell, a 20-year-old pre-law student, and his friend, 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing by the shore of the lake when they were approached by a man wearing a strange black hooded costume. The man, who would later identify himself as the Zodiac, also had a white crosshair symbol drawn on the chest of his outfit. He carried a gun, but this time he chose a different method for his attack. The killer told the couple that he was an escaped convict from Deer Lodge Prison in Montana and that he needed their car and money to make his getaway to Mexico. After calming their initial fear, the Zodiac ordered Brian to tie Cecilia's hands behind her back with pre-cut lengths of plastic cord. He then bound Brian and used a knife to stab each of them repeatedly. Brian was stabbed 6 times while Cecilia was stabbed 10 times. After the attack, the Zodiac casually walked back to Brian's car, where he drew the crosshair symbol on the car door with a black marker and wrote the dates of his previous attacks, along with the time and location of the Lake Berryessa attack. Remarkably, Brian Hartnell survived the vicious assault, though Cecilia Shepard was not as fortunate. She passed away 2 days later in the hospital due to the severity of her injuries. Before leaving the scene, the Zodiac called the Napa County Police Department from a payphone reporting the attack himself. He calmly told the dispatcher, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder," and gave them the exact location of the crime. Investigators were able to trace the call to a payphone only a few miles away from the crime scene, but by the time police arrived, the Zodiac had disappeared. Brian Hartnell's survival provided investigators with another first-hand account of the killer, but the description was unusual. The killer had worn a full hood that concealed his face, making it impossible for Brian to give any detailed physical description beyond what the killer's voice sounded like and some general physical features. This attack also marked a departure from the Zodiac's previous methods, as he had used a knife rather than a gun, adding a new layer of unpredictability to his pattern of violence. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac killer would strike again, but this time in the heart of San Francisco, far from the secluded rural locations of his earlier attacks. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, picked up a passenger near Union Square in downtown San Francisco. The passenger requested a ride to the upscale neighborhood of Presidio Heights. When Stein reached the destination, the passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. This attack differed from the Zodiac's earlier crimes in several key ways. Stein was not part of a couple, nor was he in a remote location. Instead, this was an individual attack in a highly populated urban area. After the murder, the Zodiac did something particularly bold. He lingered at the scene long enough to rummage through Stein's belongings, wiping down the car to remove fingerprints and tearing a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt as a grisly souvenir. Several witnesses saw the killer from a distance as he walked away from the crime scene, but their descriptions varied. Despite being spotted by passers-by, he managed to escape into the night without being apprehended. The murder of Paul Stein shocked investigators because it marked a significant change in the Zodiac's method of operation. Up until this point, the Zodiac had primarily targeted couples in remote areas. The murder of a lone cab driver in a busy city marked a drastic escalation in the killer's brazenness. However, it was the evidence the Zodiac left behind that helped to further confirm his identity. Just days after the murder, the Zodiac sent yet another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, this time enclosing a piece of Paul Stein's torn shirt to prove that he was responsible for the killing. In this letter, the Zodiac taunted the police, ridiculing their efforts to capture him. He also made threats against school children, claiming he would shoot the tires of a school bus and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. This threat caused panic throughout the Bay Area, prompting increased security around local schools and buses. Although the Zodiac never followed through on this threat, it added to the sense of terror surrounding his reign of violence. The Paul Stine murder also provided police with more concrete evidence than previous attacks. In addition to the shirt fragment, eyewitnesses gave varying but helpful descriptions of the suspect, describing him as a white male, approximately 25 to 30 years old, around 5'8" to 5'10", with a stocky build and reddish-brown hair. This description, combined with evidence from the crime scene, gave law enforcement a clearer picture of the killer, though it still wasn't enough to lead to an arrest. The Zodiac's sudden shift from targeting young couples in rural areas to killing an individual in the middle of San Francisco highlighted his unpredictable nature and made him even more difficult to track. His willingness to leave evidence behind, such as Paul Stine's shirt, showed that the Zodiac was not only taunting law enforcement but also playing a dangerous game with the public, instilling fear at every turn while continuing to evade capture. The investigation into the Zodiac killer was one of the largest and most challenging cases in American law enforcement history. Beginning in 1969, after the Zodiac sent letters to the media claiming responsibility for multiple murders, police from various agencies worked to track down the elusive killer. The Zodiac taunted law enforcement through a series of letters and ciphers, many of which contained cryptic messages about his crimes and future intentions. He made direct contact with the police, often claiming responsibility for killings and threatening future violence, but despite their efforts, investigators struggled to find concrete leads. One of the most prominent suspects was Arthur Leigh Allen, a Vallejo man who drew significant attention from law enforcement. He lived near many of the Zodiac crime scenes and was known for his interest in weapons and cryptography. Additionally, Allen had a history of disturbing behavior, including a conviction for child molestation, and reportedly made statements that aligned with the Zodiac's motives, such as his fascination with killing people and using the name Zodiac. A Zodiac brand watch with the same crosshair symbol the killer used was found in his possession. However, despite this circumstantial evidence, Allen's handwriting did not match the Zodiac's, and DNA testing on letters sent by the Zodiac did not match Allen's DNA, leaving him uncharged when he died in 1992. Other suspects emerged over the years, including Lawrence Kane, who was linked to the Bay Area and had a history of mental illness, and Rick Marshall, a projectionist whose background in film raised suspicion among investigators. Richard Gaikowski, a journalist who worked in San Francisco, was also considered a potential suspect due to his appearance and proximity to the crimes. However, none of these men were definitively linked to the Zodiac killings, and investigators were left without solid proof. The Zodiac's clever use of misdirection and his ability to evade capture made the investigation difficult. His letters contained misleading information, and his attacks were inconsistent, making it hard to establish a clear pattern. The shift from attacking couples in rural areas to the murder of a lone cab driver in San Francisco further complicated matters. He also took credit for crimes that may not have been his, adding to the confusion. As the years passed and technology advanced, investigators hoped that DNA analysis might provide a breakthrough. In the early 2000s, partial DNA profiles were extracted from envelopes sent by the Zodiac, but no matches were found. Despite these efforts, the case remains unsolved, and the Zodiac's identity is still unknown, making him one of the most notorious and elusive serial killers in American history. The Zodiac killer's reign of terror in the late 1960s and early 1970s sent shockwaves throughout Northern California, creating a sense of fear and paranoia that affected entire communities. The randomness of the killings, targeting couples in isolated areas, then later a lone cab driver in a busy city, left the public feeling vulnerable. The Zodiac's unpredictability made it impossible to know who might be his next victim. He struck without warning and then disappeared into the night, leaving behind few clues. This sense of powerlessness gripped Northern California, especially in the Bay Area, where many of the attacks took place. The media played a crucial role in amplifying both the fear and the fascination surrounding the Zodiac. On July 31, 1969, the Zodiac sent his first letters to three major newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained a portion of a cipher with the claim that the solution would reveal his identity. The Zodiac demanded that these ciphers be published on the front pages of the newspapers, and he threatened further violence if his demands were not met. This immediate interaction between the killer and the media placed the Zodiac directly in the public eye, setting the stage for what would become an ongoing dialogue between him and the press. As soon as the first letters were published, the public response was immediate. People across California and beyond became engrossed in the mystery, with amateur cryptographers and everyday citizens attempting to solve the ciphers. Some feared that the Zodiac was watching, perhaps even living among them, as his chilling letters suggested a killer who enjoyed taunting both the public and law enforcement. Others were drawn to the morbid fascination of trying to decode the mind of a serial killer, turning the Zodiac case into a media sensation. With each new letter or cipher, the media frenzy intensified. The Zodiac's letters, filled with threats, puzzles, and cryptic statements, kept the public and law enforcement on edge. Every letter was treated as a significant event, with newspapers printing detailed analyses and updates on the ongoing investigation. The Zodiac's threats against school children in particular fueled widespread panic, leading to increased security measures in schools and on school buses. Parents feared for their children's safety, and communities felt the weight of living under the constant threat of an unseen killer. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Every time a new letter or cipher was published, it not only heightened the public's fear, but also increased the scrutiny on the police. The media's coverage kept the case in the spotlight, and the Zodiac's ability to elude capture added to the perception that the killer was outsmarting the authorities. Investigators faced the dual challenge of trying to solve the murders while also managing the public's anxiety. The press frequently highlighted the frustrations and setbacks in the case, putting even more pressure on law enforcement to deliver results. As the Zodiac continued his correspondence, he became almost like a character in a real-life horror story, one that the media and public followed with morbid curiosity. His letters and ciphers were published in newspapers, discussed on television, and analyzed by experts. Each new communication added to the sense of unpredictability surrounding the case, keeping the Zodiac front and center in the minds of those who lived through the terror. Even decades later, the Zodiac remains one of the most infamous figures in American crime, in part due to the role that the media played in publicizing his horrific acts and his ongoing taunts. In the end, the Zodiac used the media as a tool to manipulate public perception and to keep his presence looming large in Northern California. His cryptic communications, his threats of future violence, and the intense media coverage of the case contributed to the lasting legacy of fear that his crimes instilled in the community, a fear that lingers even now, long after his last confirmed letter. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Zodiac killer case and want more true crime content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more cases coming soon.